You take exception, and I think you challenge the conventional mainstream media view that the Kuwait-Iraq crisis is the first major event of the so-called post-Cold War era. Am I correct in that?
That's right in a number of respects. First of all, I'm rather skeptical about the phrase post-Cold War era, but even accepting that, the first major crisis involving military action in this era was the invasion of Panama. By that, it was post-Cold War in the sense that although the action itself was so normal as to be hardly more than a footnote to history, it's the first time in a long, long time, in fact, actually since 1917, that U.S. military actions and aggression in this case have not been justified on the pretext of defense against the Soviet threat. The pretext was never at all credible, but this time it was quite beyond anyone's imagination to construct. In that respect, this was a post-Cold War invasion, post-Cold War use of military force. It had to be justified on different pretexts. And in fact, in many respects, it's rather similar to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
Well, do you see any positive results evolving from the fairly united international effort to force Saddam Hussein to evacuate from Kuwait?
I wish that I did see some, but I don't. I happen to agree with those international efforts, but the only reason they're taking place is because the United States is allowing them to take place. There's a lot of nonsense being produced now about how the UN is finally living up to its responsibilities in the post-Cold War era, with superpower conflict ending. We don't have to worry anymore about Russian recalcitrance, and we can put aside the psychic disorders of the Third World and so on and so forth, and now the UN can finally do what it was designed to do. The fact of the matter is that surely for the past 20 years, the major reason why the United Nations has not been able to do what it was designed to do is because the United States blocked it. The United States is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions and in voting, often in isolation or virtual isolation, on General Assembly resolutions on a wide range of issues, including the Middle East, aggression, observance of international law, disarmament, environmental issues, you name it. That's why the UN was unable to act. Now the UN is more or less, actually less than we claim, but more or less acting in accordance with U.S. demands, so therefore it's able to act. It's as simple as that. In fact, the cynicism on this matter is just mind-boggling. For example, on yesterday, that's Sunday the 15th.
16th.
The New York Times Magazine had a story about Daniel Moynihan, praising him as the great exponent of observance of international law, who's finally come into his own now that the principles for which he has fought all his life others have come around to accept understanding the importance of the principles for which he has fought so hard, et cetera, et cetera. That's about I don't know, I've seen a dozen articles like that about Moynihan, who just came out with a book on international law. And it's perfectly true that in this book on international law, Moynihan says it's a terrible thing, we haven't observed international law, we should do it, and so on and so forth. But there is a few slight omissions in this story. For example, the article in the New York Times praises Moynihan for his service at the United Nations, but doesn't say what he was doing there. What he was doing was ensuring that the UN couldn't function. In fact, he describes that with great pride in his memoirs, referring to the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1975. He says that the United States wanted things to turn out as they did, and that he had the assignment of making sure that the United Nations could not act in any constructive way to terminate or reverse the Indonesian aggression, and he carried out that task with remarkable success. He then, in the next sentence, goes on to say that he's aware of the nature of that success, says that 2 months later, reports surfaced that the Indonesian invasion had killed off about 10% of the population of East Timor in 2 months. A proportion of the population which he says, he then goes on to say, is about the same as the proportion of people in Eastern Europe killed by Hitler. So he's taking pride in having stopped the United Nations from interfering with an aggression that he himself compares with Hitler's invasion of Eastern Europe, and then he drops it at that. Well, this is the man who's telling us to observe international law and praising the United Nations for finally coming around to recognize its duty and to live up to its historic mission. I mean, putting aside his own stand, the interview with him and the praise for his book, front cover story again in the Times Book Review and so on, and other articles citing him as an exponent, an apostle of international law in the United Nations, that presses cynicism beyond its outer limits.
It would seem that the Gulf crisis would generate much interest in energy conservation, the institution of serious energy conservation measures in this country, developing alternative sources, but that doesn't seem to be happening.
Not really, because it's not really very relevant. The issue in the Gulf crisis is not shortage of oil, and it's not U.S. dependence on Middle East oil. It's pretty easy to see that, in fact. The U.S. position toward the Middle East has been since the 1940s that those energy reserves, by far the largest and the cheapest energy reserves in the world, that those would be dominated by the United States and its clients, and that no other force would be tolerated. Surely no foreign force would be tolerated had that been a realistic possibility, and it wasn't after the British and the French were pretty much expelled. There's a lot of talk about the Russians, but it was just talk. Crucially, it would not, no independent indigenous force would be tolerated. Now that was U.S. policy in the 1950s. It motivated the U.S. opposition to Nasser by the mid-50s, once it was recognized that he was an independent nationalist and wouldn't just play our game. It motivated the strategic alliance with Israel and with the Shah in opposition to what's called radical nationalism, meaning independent nationalism, and on to the present. Now, why is that relevant? Well, until the early 1970s, we barely imported any Middle East oil, but we had exactly the same position. And in fact, if we didn't use one drop of Middle East oil today, we would have exactly the same position. The issue is who controls the world's major energy supplies. And it is understood that whoever controls those, whoever can administer production levels and prices within narrow limits, because there isn't much of a range, but whoever can administer them within those limits has a very powerful lever over world affairs and over other countries, and we're going to make sure we have that. Whether we use a drop, we could be completely self-sufficient. It wouldn't change this a bit.
I'm wondering if you could comment about media images, and I'm thinking of the late 1970s with those horrific pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini gracing the covers of Time and Newsweek, and 11 years later, the same issues of hostages, the Middle East, and oil, and the butcher of Baghdad, Saddam Hussein, on the cover, snarling and sneering at readers.
Right, and in the 1960s, it was Jamal Abdel Nasser who was the monster who had to be destroyed. Part of the reason for the extreme enthusiasm about Israel's 1967 victory and the U.S. participation in it. And in fact, just simply in the case of Saddam Hussein, we don't have to go back that far. Go back to August 1st, and he was a favored U.S. client. The United States was offering him credits, lavishing support on him. The U.S. was his major trading partner. We were the largest market for his oil. We were providing 40% of his food. The Iraqi-American Business Forum was praising his progress toward democracy. He was just a good guy. A day later, he was the new incarnation of Genghis Khan and Hitler. No new crimes, and true, the aggression in Kuwait was one new crime, but pretty small in comparison with the record that he'd already compiled. What happened is he conflicted with U.S. interests, period. That's what matters. He could invade Iran, he could murder thousands of Kurds with poison gas. He could set up one of the most brutal tyrannies in the world, if not the most. And that was all just fine as long as he was seen as conforming to U.S. interests. When it became clear that he was another one of these radical nationalists who's going to go his own way, oh yeah, then he falls, right, he picks up the mantle of Nasser and Gaddafi and Khomeini and anybody else who gets in their way.
How about Noriega?
Noriega is there. It's kind of intriguing. For example, Bernard Trainor, who's the former Marine general, who's a former U.S. Times military correspondent and now head of some security studies program at Harvard. He had an op-ed in the New York Times saying, drawing the connection between Noriega and Hussein, saying, you know, Hussein, like Noriega, has to go. This is the most. There is something in common between the two. What's in common between the two is that they both got in the way of the United States. That's about the limits of what they have in common. I mean, Noriega was a crook, but a kind of a very minor gangster. Saddam Hussein was, while we were sporting him, was one of the major monsters of the current period. But like Noriega, he opposed U.S. interests. Noriega was also a friend, still a gangster and a drug peddler and everything else, but a friend because he was seen as serving U.S. interests. When it became clear that he was following too independent a course, when he was starting to get in the way of the U.S. attack on Nicaragua instead of participating actively in it and so on, when he was pursuing the Contadora process, well, he just had to go. So then his crimes, which are quite petty in comparison with the people we support, they could be used against him. And now Saddam Hussein's crimes, which really are hideous, can be brought up against him. 2 months ago, the same crimes, but they just didn't matter. He was progressing, and he was a perfectly acceptable, in fact, favored partner.
I'm interested in this issue of cognitive dissonance, and I know you've talked about this and commented on it. You know, how can someone like Bush, for example, or his Secretary of State Baker, and earlier you cited Daniel Moynihan, how can they be talking about international law and violating the rights of sovereignty of nations as a grave crime, et cetera, et cetera? How do they reconcile that with Panama, for example, or Grenada, or any of the
Panama,
other?
the World Court proceedings, which condemned the United States for the unlawful use of force. Let's just take Panama, and a whole record all the way back. Just take Panama. Yesterday, again on Sunday, the press announced that with great pleasure that maybe it was today, that the Security Council had voted a severe condemnation of Iraq for its break-in at the foreign embassies, French and other embassies. And that's quite right. In fact, when they broke in, the press was just outraged. I mean, this was an attack on diplomacy itself, the New York Times said. And in fact, they, for the first time, demanded that he be tried as a war criminal. And the UN resolution was published in full and with great prominence and so on. Well, I haven't seen anyone point out the obvious. That's the second time that's happened this year. In mid-January, the United Nations Security Council voted a resolution condemning a country for violating diplomatic immunity in a case very similar to this one. Namely, the U.S. troops broke into the Nicaraguan compound, smashed it up, and so on and so forth. And the Security Council had a resolution which was vetoed by the United States. That's it. There was a Security Council resolution condemning the invasion, vetoed by the United States. There was a General Assembly resolution condemning the invasion. In fact, just more recently, the Catholic Church has described the U.S. in Panama, the U.S. invasion, as the worst tragedy in the history of the country, and a commission has also condemned the invasion. And going back in the United Nations, as I mentioned before, the United States is very far in the lead in preventing it from acting on issues of observance of international law, aggression, and so on and so forth. So to get back to your question, how can they do these things? Well, I mean, there's depends on the individual, but there are several possible answers. One possible answer, some may simply be total cynics. Most likely, they are people who have acquired or had naturally a certain technique, which is almost it's almost a filter through that you have to pass through in order to get to a leadership position, and that is that you be capable of erasing totally anything that from your mind, anything that conflicts with your need to serve powerful interests. You got to be able to erase it, and then you don't have cognitive dissonance.
The level of conformity is startling, even by U.S. standards, on this issue. You know, I kept waiting for at these daily press conferences that Bush would hold in Maine and now in Washington, for one single reporter to get up, even if he didn't believe in what he was saying, and just challenging the administration line on this issue about international law and the sanctity of borders, etc., bringing up the issue of Panama. Not one of them, not one, came forward.
No. And what's more, I have yet to see anywhere, say, an op-ed or an editorial running through the record on this and pointing out the utter hypocrisy of it. Incidentally, I know that such op-eds have been submitted to major newspapers but turned down.
Some years ago, you said that anti-Arab sentiments it's the last form, the last vestige of respectable racism in the United States today. Do you see any elements of that racism in this current crisis?
I think it is just flagrant. I mean, the reaction is utterly racist. And of course, you find this in outright racist journals like, say, the New Republic, which are just reeking with anti-Arab racism, but that's always the case. But even in parts of the media that try to retain a level of minimal respectability on this, the anti-Arab racism is just, it just screams at you. This has incidentally been true for a long time, but it's quite apparent now.
I happened to be listening to a Christian religious broadcast, and the comments about Islam breeds violence and the Quran sanctifies terrorism and holy wars. I mean, it was rather astounding to hear all of this stuff.
Well, that's typical of a racist culture. Christianity doesn't breed violence. I mean, is the history of Europe very pretty?
Where's Israel, the strategic asset in this crisis? Why is it on the sidelines, seemingly?
Seemingly is the right word. It remains a base for U.S. power, and if the United States decides to go to war, as it very well may, plunging the area into total chaos and possibly catastrophe, Israel will be a major part of that. But right now, it's much more the United States, which much prefer for Israel to keep a low profile, and they've surely been ordered to do that. The reason is that the very fragile pretense of an Arab force is crucial for propaganda purposes, and that would collapse instantaneously if Israel were to take an active part. In fact, probably the whole Arab world would be in flames. The United States troops would be finding themselves involved in counterinsurgency.
I'm interested that you use this term Arab world because it's mystified me a little bit. You don't hear about the Slavic world or the Hindu world or the Buddhist world.
Or the Christian world.
Yeah, I mean, is this part of that racist framework?
It is. It's all, in fact.
And we use it.
Sure, we use it. I use it too.
Yeah.
I mean, the Arab world is so-called Arab world is as complex and diverse and so on as the European world.
What about the internal feuds within the region? I mean, people are rather surprised here to find, for example, someone like Hafez al-Assad lining up against Saddam Hussein.
Well, Assad has been a sworn enemy of Hussein for a long time. I mean, they represent two wings of essentially the same secular nationalist, internationalist, actually, Arab movement, the Ba'ath Party, but different wings, and they've been at each other's throats for years. I mean, Assad supported Iran. He's the only major Arab state to have supported Iran during the Iraq-Iran war. So this is just a continuation of it. It's interesting But all of a sudden, Assad has become a good guy here. So now, in fact, this morning there's an article in the New York Times saying, well, of course, he's not very nice, but much better than Saddam Hussein. 2 months ago, Saddam Hussein was much better than he was. In fact, they're pretty much on a par. But he's on our side, so therefore he's got real promise.
Well, hasn't Bush and his administration really painted itself into a corner in comments like Iraq's occupation of Kuwait will not stand. It will not be tolerated. I mean, is he giving Saddam Hussein any avenue to compromise?
Well, I think in my view, that's a rather odd way to put it, because in fact, there have been several offers from Iraq on a negotiating track that could be followed to end the conflict with Iraqi withdrawal. And they've been turned down by the United States. So it's not a matter of the United States offering a possible compromise as it is right now. It's a matter of the United States refusing to permit a diplomatic track to be pursued. In fact, there was a rather remarkable article in the front page article in the New York Times by their chief diplomatic correspondent, Thomas Friedman, a couple of weeks ago, August 22nd, I think, saying that there's a great concern in Washington, which he supported, that others might find the diplomatic track too tempting. And in fact, on this issue, I think you can see a real difference between the United States and most of the rest of the world. Not all. So Kuwaiti nationals and Israel basically agree with the United States, and some others do, but most of the world is tending in a different direction. And that's over what is, in fact, the crucial issue right now. I mean, there is a general hope that economic measures of some kind, some form of embargo, will succeed in compelling Iraq to withdraw and reverse the aggression. But suppose they don't. Then what? Well, there are then two ways to achieve that end. One way is war, and the other is diplomacy. And the way I read the international situation, most of the world prefers diplomacy, and the United States is gearing up for war. There apparently are diplomatic options and a diplomatic track. We really can't be sure of that, since every such opportunity has instantaneously been shut off and, in fact, barely reported. But there certainly have been proposals floated that look like possible diplomatic options.
Wasn't there an Iraqi offer to talk about withdrawal from all occupied Arab lands?
Yeah, that was on August 12th. That was the first of them. Exactly how serious it was, we don't know, because it was instantly rejected. There was another one. There were several others, too. There was an Iraqi proposal on August 19th to treat the Kuwait affair as an Arab problem, as a problem of the Arab world and the Arab League, and have it settled in the same manner as Syrian forces in Lebanon and Moroccan forces in the Western Sahara. And that was rejected out of hand as well. The argument there was an argument for rejecting it, namely that in that arena, Saddam Hussein could expect to be highly influential, in fact, perhaps to prevail. And that has some logic to it, except for one small point. He was simply stealing a leaf from the U.S. book. Every time the United States intervenes in the Western Hemisphere, it immediately stands up and denounces the rest of the world for trying to get involved. So, like, it'll veto Security Council resolutions calling for an end to hostilities or whatever, on the grounds that this is a Western Hemisphere affair and we can handle it ourselves. You guys keep away. Why? Well, because we can hope to prevail as long as it's just Western Hemisphere. We've done the same in the Middle East, for example, trying to bar UN intervention in Cyprus when Turkey invaded Cyprus, and keeping it, in fact, earlier, back in the early 60s, and keeping it a NATO issue. The third, however, and more important proposal from Iraq was later. It was on August 23rd, and again, we do not know much about it or how serious it was because it was pretty much suppressed. But on August 23rd, a proposal was brought to Washington by a former high U.S. official with Iraqi connections, an Iraqi proposal, calling for, and this had terms that were quite forthcoming, called for an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, end sanctions, freeing of anyone detained, all the hostages. No precondition that the U.S. troops withdraw or any other precondition. The only terms that Iraq insisted on in this proposal were, one, some form of guaranteed access to the Gulf, and two, control of the Ramallah oil fields, which are about 95% inside Iraq and 5% inside Kuwait on what has always been a contested border. Now, that proposal was described by a White House Middle East spokesman who was quoted in the press as serious and negotiable, and it certainly sounds that. How serious and how negotiable it is, we don't know, because it was instantaneously rejected by the United States, and in fact largely suppressed by the press. The offer had apparently been leaked to the New York Times, which didn't publish it. It was then published a week later by Newsday, Long Island newspaper, very prominently. And at that point, the Times had to refer to it, but it buried the thing and just dismissed it as baloney, and that was in a paragraph, and that was the end of it. It hasn't been referred to since. There are other proposals. There are several proposals attributed to the PLO and the Jordan, calling for Iraqi withdrawal and a plebiscite and other possibilities. How realistic they are, again, we do not know. As long as the United States rejects them, and as long as the media won't report them, we do not know. But the logic of the situation is pretty clear. If the embargo does not succeed in a limited time, then the options will be war or diplomacy. And if diplomacy is cut off, it will be war.
If sanctions don't work, if, say, 6 months from now...
I don't think the United States will wait 6 months. Just imagine the situation, say, 2 months from now. And let's imagine what it's going to look like. Well, we can't be certain, but here's a possibility. It's not implausible, in fact. 2 months from now, we may find a huge American army, a couple 100,000 men, suffering in the desert. Not much fun. Isolated, dying of the heat, the tanks not functioning, and so on. The U.S. economy heading into a tailspin. Germany and Japan are major rivals doing business as usual. They don't really want to have any part of this and regard it as a bilateral arrangement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. So doing just fine. The embargo is starting to leak, which is likely. Turmoil increasing in the Arab world, which is likely. Conflicts developing between the U.S. military forces and the local population, which is also likely, no matter, even if they're superbly well behaved. Too many opportunities for conflict. Just imagine that situation. What does George Bush do at that time? Well, either you withdraw the army, which is unimaginable, or you use it.
Do you favor the military option in getting Iraq out of Kuwait?
The military option?
Yeah.
Would be crazy. First of all, unless it were authorized by the UN Security Council, which is highly unlikely, it's also illegal. But putting aside law, which has never bothered us, it would be a crazy thing to do. It would be wrong and crazy. I mean, it could. For one thing, it isn't clear that the United States has a military option. Western military analysts are by no means certain of that. Western military attachés in Baghdad, for example, have been arguing that it would be extremely costly for the United States to attempt a forceful removal of the Iraqi army. And the consequences of that, quite apart from the uncountable number, we have no idea how many people would be killed in the operation itself. The longer term, the broader effects are quite incalculable. I mean, it could have catastrophic effects throughout the entire region, up to, in fact, destroying large parts of the world energy reserves. It's just an extremely grave and ominous possibility. Now, quite apart from the fact that nothing remotely similar has ever been done in comparable cases of aggression, in that region or elsewhere.
I didn't follow something you said. You said that even if the UN Security Council voted in favor of military action, it would be illegal?
No, unless the UN Security Council voted in favor of action, authorized and directed the action, it would be illegal.
How does this crisis affect the Palestinians and the Intifada?
I think it's a catastrophe for the Palestinians. If there's a war, Israel will use the opportunity and, I suppose, be authorized by the United States to invade Jordan, which they've been itching to do for a long time. Both major parties in Israel and the U.S. government regard Jordan as a Palestinian state, and what their long-term goal would then be to invade Jordan, the Palestinian state, remove much of the population of the occupied territories to the Palestinian state, bring in Russian immigrants, expand their natural borders, and so on. And that's not unlikely in the context of a war. If there's no war, I think the situation will end up with an even tighter alliance between the United States and the militarily strong forces in the region, committed to opposition to any form of Palestinian or other indigenous nationalism.
Do you think that Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait sort of vindicates the the Likud line in Israel that, you can't trust the Arabs, they're terrorists, they're barbaric aggressors, etc.?
Within Israel itself?
Yes.
Well, I think it's strengthened that position. In fact, there's been a shameful response on the part of parts of the so-called peace movement. The most prominent example is Yossi Sarid, whose column in Israel about how that's the last time I talked to the Palestinians, they can forget about me, that column was reprinted in the Wall Street Journal. And segments of the Israeli peace movement have followed him on that. Not all, I should say. He was pretty harshly criticized, too. Shulamit Aloni, for example, who's a leading civil libertarian for many years in Israel, and from Yossi Sarid's party, the Citizens' Rights Party. She had a couple of interviews in which she pointed out quite honestly that she doesn't care at all about the Palestinians. She doesn't care really what happens to them and never has. She cares about the Jews and about Israel, and she will continue to talk to the Palestinians because she cares about the Jews in Israel. And she furthermore went on to say, without mentioning Sarid's name, that we like to pretend, she said, speaking of the Israeli peace movement, she said, we like to pretend that we've done things for the Palestinians and that they're being ungrateful. But in fact, we've done nothing for them. We've done things only for ourselves. We did nothing to really help relieve their suffering until it started to harm us. I never cared about it. And they have nothing to be grateful to us about. And let's not make pretenses about that. She also said something which is immediately intelligible to an Israeli audience, though I don't know if people would understand it here. She said, this is after all, she said people are comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler, and this is not the first time that nationalists in the Middle East have tried to have expressed their support for Hitler. She was referring, of course, to the Prime Minister of Israel, who was the Yitzhak Shamir, who was the head of a group, Lehi, the so-called Stern Gang, in 1941, which made overtures to the Nazis, not out of expediency, but out of agreement, offering to become the outpost for the Third Reich in the Middle East. That's very well known in Israel, and maybe not known here. Others have also been extremely critical. The Israeli satirist Beit Michael, Michael was very prominent satirist, had a column in which he ran through a list of monsters who Israel has cheerfully supported, essentially them and supporting Saddam Hussein? Do we talk to ourselves? And one could. There have been others as well. But the peace movement has certainly been, such as it is, has been much weakened and deeply split over this issue.
Coming back home, is there anything that people can do here in the United States?
Oh, there's a lot. I think we should face the likelihood that we are moving towards a situation in which the choices are going to be pretty stark: diplomacy or war. If we don't want war with all of its catastrophic consequences, we have to be preparing the grounds for diplomacy. Now, there are possibilities right now, and there will be increasing possibilities over the next couple of months. They will, if they continue to be turned down by Washington, they will be suppressed by the press. After all, that's their job, to serve power, not to tell the truth. And that means it's going to be a little hard to find out about them, and hard to gain publicity for them or to develop support for pursuing them. But that has to be done, or the alternative will be a war with possibly quite catastrophic consequences.
Thank you very much, Noam Chomsky.